The precise arc of a compass, the whisper of graphite across vellum, these were the anchors of my existence. I, Reid, found solace in the immutable lines of geography, in the certainty of surveyed boundaries and the elegant logic of scale. My world was one of meticulous detail, where every contour held meaning, every projection a truth. I charted forgotten roads, resurrected sunken cities from ancient texts, and breathed life into landscapes long since swallowed by time. It was a craft demanding patience, an eye for the infinitesimal, and a mind that craved order. Yet, even in the quiet sanctity of my studio, a cold tendril of unease had begun to unfurl. One evening, hunched over a Roman-era trade route, a sudden, jarring image bloomed behind my eyes, a dim hospital hallway with no staff, machines quietly breathing. I shook it off, attributing it to fatigue, a trick of the light, but the memory, sharp and unwelcome, etched itself into the quiet corners of my mind. The news of the inheritance had arrived shortly after, a thick envelope sealed with a crest I barely recognized. The estate, a sprawling, forgotten acreage nestled deep in the coastal wilds, was an ancestral burden I had never expected, nor desired. My family, what little I knew of its distant branches, had always been a nebulous concept, a faint echo from a past I rarely acknowledged. Now, this crumbling edifice, a relic of generations, was mine. The journey to the estate was a descent into a landscape increasingly untamed. The asphalt roads dwindled to gravel, then to little more than twin ruts carved into the earth, overhung by skeletal branches that clawed at the slate-gray sky. The air grew heavy, damp with the scent of brine and decaying foliage, a primal perfume that seeped into the very fabric of my clothes. When the house finally emerged from the shroud of ancient oaks, it was less an architectural marvel and more a monument to slow, deliberate decay. Its leaded windows, many shattered or boarded, stared out like vacant eyes. The slate roof sagged, a broken spine. A porch, once grand, now leaned precariously, its timbers groaning beneath a thick pelt of moss. Inside, the silence was absolute, a heavy blanket woven from dust and disuse. Each step on the creaking floorboards sent tremors through the ancient structure, accompanied by the rustle of unseen things scurrying in the walls. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, old wood, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like copper left too long in the rain. I moved through the echoing chambers, a stranger in my own inherited past, my fingers tracing the ornate, yet decaying, carvings on mantelpieces, the faded patterns on wallpaper peeling like sunburnt skin. It was in the library, a room choked with toppled stacks and the brittle scent of decaying paper, that I found it. Tucked away in a mahogany chest, beneath a pile of brittle ledgers and yellow deeds, lay a roll of parchment. It was unlike any map I had ever encountered. Unfurling it with painstaking care, I laid it flat upon a dust-laden table. The parchment itself was impossibly old, its edges frayed, its surface a network of fine cracks like desiccated riverbeds. The ink, a deep, rich sepia, seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. It depicted the estate, yes, but not as it stood now. This was a cartography of an older time, a more intricate landscape. Every tree, every stone wall, every brook was rendered with a horrifying precision, almost hyper-real, as if the cartographer had possessed an unnatural ability to capture not just form, but essence. My professional eye immediately recognized the meticulous detail, the sheer artistry. Yet, it was incomplete. These unmapped territories were not simply unfinished, they felt erased, or perhaps, deliberately omitted. And then there were the symbols. Scattered across the existing topography were glyphs I did not recognize, stark, angular marks that resembled no known cartographic notation. They were not mere embellishments, they seemed to denote specific, unnamed features, often clustering around what appeared to be subterranean passages or unusual land formations not visible on any modern survey. One symbol, a jagged, inverted trident, recurred with unsettling frequency, always near the edges of the blank spaces. My breath hitched. This was more than an ancient curiosity, it was a puzzle, a challenge to my very understanding of my craft. The cartographer in me thrilled at the prospect of deciphering its secrets, of completing the unfinished narrative it presented. This map was not merely a record of the land, it felt like a living thing, a coiled serpent waiting to strike, its secrets breathing just beneath the surface of the parchment. I felt an undeniable pull, a strange compulsion to understand what lay within its blank spaces, what truths the ancient ink had so carefully guarded. The estate, I realized, was not just an inheritance of land and stone, it was an inheritance of mystery, a meticulously drawn invitation to something profoundly unsettling. My determination hardened, yet a shiver traced its way down my spine, a presentiment of the profound depths into which this ancient document would inevitably lead me. The estate, a sprawling canvas of neglect, lay before me, its ancient bones shrouded by a verdant, grasping shroud. My compass, a cold, reassuring weight in my palm, seemed to hum with a restless energy, eager to cut through the wildness, to impose order. I began my survey where the modern property deeds, dry and unyielding, claimed a clear boundary. Here, the fence line, rusted wire swallowed by thorny brambles, hinted at a forgotten path. My initial steps were methodical, a cartographer's ballet of measurement and observation. I walked the perimeter, my gaze sweeping the horizon, comparing the physical world to the sterile precision of contemporary surveys. The modern deeds spoke of clearings and manageable woodlands. What I found was a dense, suffocating tangle of growth, ancient oaks with limbs like gnarled fists, their roots buckling the earth, and an understory so thick it swallowed the light. There were places where the vegetation grew with an unnatural vigor, an almost sentient insistence, obscuring views, swallowing sounds. I pushed through, the scratch of branches against my canvas trousers a constant, irritating chorus. Soon, the discrepancies began to bloom like strange, unsettling fungi. The old map, the one unearthed from the estate's forgotten archives, showed faint, dashed lines where the modern surveys depicted only forest. It was too substantial for a garden border, too robust for a mere property marker. It snaked into the gloom beneath the trees, hinting at a structure far larger than its exposed fragments suggested, a skeleton of something grander, now buried by time and growth. I consulted the antique map again, tracing the faded ink with a gloved finger. Its symbols, at first ambiguous, now seemed to leap out, suggesting a complex network beneath the surface, a sprawling network of features. The estate wasn't merely overgrown, it was concealing. As the sun climbed higher, casting dappled light through the canopy, I noticed how certain areas clung to a profound, almost aggressive gloom. Then came the sounds. At first, I dismissed them as the ordinary symphony of the wild, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the scurry of unseen creatures. But then, a new note threaded itself into the tapestry of the forest. A low, persistent hum, like the distant thrum of heavy machinery, yet too organic, too deep to be mechanical. It seemed to rise from the very earth beneath my feet, a subterranean vibration that pulsed through the soles of my boots. It would swell, then recede, never quite disappearing, a constant, unsettling presence. Sometimes, it was accompanied by a faint, wet-sucking sound, like something being drawn slowly from mud, or perhaps, something breathing. The map led me deeper, away from the familiar, towards a section marked with a series of small, concentric circles. Here, the trees grew in an odd, almost geometric pattern, there. Branches interlocking in a way that formed a natural, somber archway. They were not grave markers, nor boundary stones in any conventional sense. They were irregular, unadorned monoliths, placed with an eerie precision, forming an incomplete circle. Their surfaces were smooth, worn not by weather, but by what felt like untold centuries of subtle erosion, perhaps by something other than wind and rain. The forest, the stones, the very ground beneath me seemed to waver, to dissolve into a shimmering haze. My vision blurred, and for a terrifying, fleeting instant, the dense green canopy above me was replaced by a low, sterile ceiling. The persistent hum from the earth was momentarily overshadowed by a different drone, a quiet, rhythmic exhalation. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the hallucination receded, dissolving like mist. I blinked, my heart hammering against my ribs, and the forest coalesced around me once more. The rough stone, cool beneath my fingers, was real. The discrepancies were no longer just anomalies, they were invitations, drawing me closer to something ancient and malevolent, something that felt as if it had been waiting for me, for my lineage, all along. And the quiet, mechanical breathing of that phantom hallway echoed in my ears, a premonition of a different kind of confinement. The unsettling map, tucked into a waterproof satchel, felt almost warm against my hip, an anachronistic pulse against the cool steel of my instrument. I had spent days now, meticulously charting the overgrown boundaries, verifying the existing lines, and attempting to fill the voids in the inherited parchment. The work was demanding, a constant battle against the encroaching tendrils of ivy and the stubborn roots of forgotten shrubs, but it was also a balm, a familiar ritual that quieted the anxieties stirred by this place. Yet, even in the focused rhythm of my task, a subtle dissonance began to intrude. My eyes were tired, my mind perhaps overstimulated by the sheer scale of the project. They seemed to emanate from the very walls of the estate house when I returned at dusk, or from the dense thicket of the woods when I ventured too deep. Not words, exactly, but a soft, sibilant current, a breath held just beyond the threshold of understanding. I attributed it to the house settling, the old timbers groaning, or the wind finding strange pathways through the decaying structures. Isolation, I reasoned, could play tricks on the ear. The rationalizations, however, began to fray when the physical world itself seemed to subtly shift. My drafting pens, which I meticulously arranged by size on my work table, would sometimes be found askew, or a specific drawing compass, its brass glinting, would be displaced from its velvet-lined box to lie carelessly on the floor. A particular volume on local folklore, which I had left open on the parlor's mahogany table, would be discovered closed, its bookmark slipped out, pages disturbed. These were small things, easily dismissed as my own absent-mindedness, the fatigue of long days, or the general disarray of an old house. But the pattern, faint as a watermark, was beginning to etch itself into my awareness. A quiet, persistent erosion of my logical facade. The most disturbing alteration, however, manifested on the map itself. I had been working on a section detailing the estate's western boundary, a stretch of land that sloped steeply towards a choked ravine. My ancestral map, usually so precise in its imperfections, had always shown this area as relatively uniform, marked by a sparse scattering of pines. But as I leaned over the parchment one evening, the oil lamp casting a warm, deceptive glow, I noticed a new detail, faint yet undeniable. These were not my lines, I knew every stroke of my own hand. They pulsed with a strange, almost organic quality, as if drawn not with ink, but with something living, something that had bled onto the paper. It was a terrifying revelation, a crack in the stable reality I so desperately clung to. That night, the dream came. It was not the familiar landscape of the estate, but a disorienting, endless corridor. Each breath they took seemed to draw the air from my own lungs. There was no one, yet the feeling of being watched was absolute, 1,000 unseen eyes boring into my back. A sense of profound violation settled upon me, as if I were trapped within a vast, decaying organism, its internal mechanisms slowly grinding. It was a sound of immense suffering, of ancient, unutterable loss. I swung my legs out of bed, the rough wool rug a welcome texture beneath my feet. The dream, vivid and unsettling, felt more like a memory, a terrible truth glimpsed through a veil. I tried to shake it off, to dismiss it as a byproduct of stress, of the estate's isolation, of the unsettling map. But the rationalizations were growing weaker, their hold increasingly tenuous. The estate was not merely decaying, it was awakening. The compass, a cold, reassuring weight in my palm, seemed to hum with a restless energy, eager to cut through the wildness, to impose order, yet I knew its true purpose now was not merely to navigate terrain, but to chart the contours of a hidden malevolence. I retreated to the estate study, a room steeped in the scent of aged paper and dormant dust motes dancing in the meager light. Here, amidst towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, I hoped to find the threads of a narrative that would explain the map's cryptic markings. My fingers, usually precise and steady, trembled as I pulled down the first brittle journal, its cover embossed with a faded family crest. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of unread histories. Hours bled into a seamless stream of frantic turning and deciphering. I unearthed a trove, meticulously penned journals, letters brittle with age, and even a collection of local almanacs detailing strange occurrences in the region. But as I delved deeper, a pattern began to emerge, a grotesque tapestry woven from madness, disappearance, and unexplainable phenomena. One entry, dated nearly a century ago, detailed the abrupt vanishing of a groundskeeper and his entire family. They spoke of voices. The ancestor had written, and a drawing, a pull into the earth itself, near the old wellspring. My eyes darted to the map. Tracing the faint, almost invisible lines that converged precisely on the location of the wellspring, a place I had dismissed as merely a natural feature. Another journal, belonging to a different branch of the family, chronicled a slow descent into delusion, its author obsessed with the shifting soil and the hunger of the deep. His final entry was a single, sprawling word, almost illegible: consume. The more I read, the more the lines on my map seemed to pulse with a hidden significance. A cluster of strange symbols near the dilapidated chapel? Each discovery was a shard of ice in my gut, solidifying a terrifying suspicion. The map was not merely a guide to physical features, it was a key, an instruction manual to something ancient and malevolent, buried beneath the very soil I now walked. The scent of decaying paper morphed into something cloying, almost metallic, like old blood. My hands, smudged with ink and dust, felt alien, the skin crawling. The words on the page blurred, then reformed into mocking shapes. A sudden, jarring shift. One moment, the musty study. The next, a profound disorientation. The air was sterile, chemical, stinging my nostrils, a stark contrast to the dust and decay of the manor. The quiet thrum of unseen machinery was a rhythm both alien and terrifyingly familiar, like a heartbeat I couldn't place. No one was there, only the endless beige walls, the muted gleam of the linoleum floor, and the suffocating sense of being utterly alone in a place designed for care, yet devoid of it. My breath hitched, a raw gasp in my throat. What was this place? How did I get here? Then, just as abruptly, I was back in the study, my fingers still gripping the brittle page of an ancestor's journal. The metallic tang lingered in my mouth. Had I fallen asleep? Had I imagined it? The vividness of the hallucination, if it was one, shook me to my core. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and order, felt porous, susceptible to invasion. The estate was not just revealing its secrets, it was eroding my sanity, piece by agonizing piece. My gaze fell upon a crude, almost childlike drawing in the margin of one of the later journals. It depicted a figure, hunched and distorted, standing over a series of lines that unmistakably mimicked the unique symbols on my map. My own. This malevolence, this ancient hunger, was tied not just to the land, but to my lineage, to me. The map was not just a key, it was an invitation, and I, Reid, was the intended guest. The true horror was not merely what lay buried beneath the earth, but what lay dormant within my own blood. And it was beginning to stir. The very air of the estate had begun to thicken, a palpable weight pressing against my skin, chilling me to the bone even as the autumn sun streamed through grimy windows. My sleep, when it came, was a fractured mosaic of dread, but now, the intrusions bled into my waking hours, staining the edges of my vision, whispering at the fringes of my hearing. I was in the study, tracing a new, faint line on the map that seemed to suggest a subterranean passage beneath the old well, when the first undeniable shift occurred. A heavy brass letter opener, a relic from a forgotten ancestor's desk, skittered across the polished mahogany surface. It wasn't a tremor, not a draft. It moved with a deliberate, scraping sound, stopping precisely at the edge of the map, its sharp point aimed at the very spot I had been studying. My hand, still holding the quill, trembled. I stared at the opener, then at the map, then back at the opener, a profound disquiet settling deep within my bones. It was too precise, too deliberate, to be anything but an intentional nudge. Then came the visual intrusions, swift and jarring, like tears in the fabric of reality. One moment, I was standing in the crumbling library, the scent of ancient paper and dust heavy in the air. The low, rhythmic hiss-click of unseen apparatus echoed with an unnerving regularity. No one moved, nothing stirred, only the mechanical breathing of the machines. My chest tightened, a phantom constriction, and I felt a wave of nausea. Just as suddenly, the vision snapped back, and I was again in the library, my hands gripping the edge of the heavy desk, my knuckles white. This was no dream. This was an invasion. A resonant vibration that seemed to originate from inside my own skull. The blood remembers. Another voice, deeper, guttural, seemed to rumble up from the cellar beneath my feet. The offering. Do. They were not just sounds, they were thoughts pressed into my mind, laden with an ancient, malevolent intent. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the words merely intensified, vibrating through my very bones. Later that evening, the physical manifestations escalated from subtle nudges to something far more aggressive. I was attempting to sketch a detail from the map, my concentration fractured by the incessant mental assault, when a sudden, violent shudder ran through the entire house. The heavy oak door to the study, which I had secured with a sturdy bolt, slammed open with a concussive force that rattled the glass in the windows. It had no discernible features, only an impression of immense, suffocating presence, and then, with a sound like tearing fabric, it dissolved back into the gloom. The room, illuminated once more, felt utterly violated. The map lay splayed on the desk, its edges now slightly curled, as if recoiling from the intrusion. This was no trick of light or sound. This was a deliberate act, a forceful declaration of dominion. My mobile phone, which usually had a weak but usable signal near the old oak tree, was utterly dead. Not merely out of range, but entirely inert, its screen black, unresponsive to any button press. I went to the landline, a dusty, antique rotary phone in the hallway. I tried the internet connection, equally useless. It was as if the estate had been severed from the rest of the world, enclosed in a bubble of silent, malevolent energy. The entity was no longer content to merely hint, it was asserting itself, a primal force awakening. I was trapped, alone with a malevolence that knew my name, knew my lineage, and wanted something terrible from me. The map, now more a curse than a key, lay open on the desk, its incomplete lines mocking my futile attempts at order. The estate was no longer just a place, it was a hungry, breathing maw, and I was caught in its throat. It was actively demanding. A low, rhythmic hiss filled the space, a sound both mechanical and organic, like some great, unseen beast drawing breath. My eyelids, heavy as leaden curtains, fought against the light, or rather, the absence of it. When they finally fluttered open, the world resolved into a muted gray, a landscape of pale walls and a ceiling that stretched into an oppressive, distant haze. I was lying down, the surface beneath me yielding slightly, cool against my skin. The air, thin and sterile, scraped at the back of my throat, tasting faintly of metal and something less definable, a ghost of forgotten sickness. This was not the estate. This was a place devoid of personality, stripped bare of all life save for the faint, insistent hum. The quiet was profound, broken only by that steady, mechanical exhalation. No footsteps echoed, no voices murmured from behind the closed doors that lined the corridor. Where was I? How had I come to be here? The last thing I remembered was the map, spread across the estate's grand, dust-laden table, its lines twisting into a sickening spiral. A jolt, sharp and sudden, pierced the fog in my mind. The map. I had been tracing its oldest contours, the faint, almost invisible script that ran along the borders of the property, a script I dismissed as decorative filigree. But something, a flicker of light from the lamp, a shift in the paper's texture, had revealed a deeper layer, a palimpsest of older, more archaic symbols beneath the more recent cartography. My fingers, trembling even in the memory, had brushed over the parchment. I'd used the estate's inherited magnifying glass, its brass frame tarnished with generations of handling, to peer closer. And then, the truth had coalesced. The faint symbols were not decorative. They were glyphs, ancient and forbidding, forming a language I instinctively understood was not meant for human eyes, a language that spoke of containment. The map, I had seen, was not a guide to hidden features, but a diagram of a prison. The lines I had so meticulously traced, believing them to denote geological formations or property boundaries, were in fact the boundaries of a vast, intricate seal. The hidden features I sought were not caches of treasure, but anchor points for an unspeakable power, a force buried deep beneath the land. My breath hitched in my throat, a dry, rasping sound in the sterile quiet of the hallway. The map, in that horrifying moment of clarity back at the estate, had shown me the truth. The estate itself was a cage. And within that cage, stirring, weakening, was an ancient, nameless thing, a malevolence older than recorded time, a force that had been dormant for centuries, held in check by the very land my ancestors had settled upon. The cryptic text, revealed beneath the surface of the map, had not just described the prison, but my own lineage's connection to it. My family, the cartographers, the keepers of the estate, had been drawn there not to inherit wealth, but to maintain a terrible vigil. We were the custodians of the seal, whether we knew it or not. The incomplete sections of the map, the very gaps I had been so determined to fill, were not errors, but crucial, weakening points in the containment, places where the ancient thing was pushing, straining against its bonds. I wasn't merely a meticulous scholar completing a historical document, I was a pawn in a cosmic game, an unwitting key. I meant to complete the map, to reinforce the failing seal, to hold back the tide of its malevolent hunger? Or was I, through my obsessive quest for completeness, inadvertently destined to unmake the prison, to shatter the last fragile barriers and unleash it upon the world? It was not the gentle hum of life support, but the slow, agonizing exhalation of something vast and ancient, a presence that was no longer merely beneath the earth, but here, in the very air I struggled to draw. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the thin gown rustling with the movement. There was no one. Just me, the breathing machines, and the horrifying knowledge that now resided, like a parasite, within my own mind. I had to get back to the estate. But a deeper, more primal instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this place, this world, before the lines of the map finally broke. When they finally fluttered open, the world resolved into a muted gray, a landscape of polished linoleum and pale, distant walls. My head throbbed, a dull, relentless drumbeat echoing the distant thrum of the machines. Each breath I drew felt thin, inadequate, as if the very oxygen had been leached of its vitality. Where was I? How had I come to be here, away from the crumbling stones of my ancestral home, from the whispering shadows of the map room? No windows offered a glimpse of the outside world, no doors stood ajar to hint at a way out. My limbs were heavy, unwilling to obey, as if bound by invisible chains. Then, a new sound began to weave itself into the mechanical hum. It was soft at first, a delicate rustle, like dry leaves skittering across forgotten flagstones. Come. Deeper. It was the entity, I knew it, here, now, more present than it had ever been. Its presence was a suffocating weight, pressing down on my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. The machines around me seemed to intensify their rhythmic sighs, their exhalations becoming deeper, more resonant, as if mirroring the entity's own monstrous breath. You sought. You found. Now, you are mine. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over me, threatening to drag me back into the gray oblivion. It was an insidious attempt, a lure into surrender, promising peace in exchange for my will. This place, this hallway, was a trap, a threshold. My gaze drifted to a particular machine at the far end of the hallway, a bulky, metallic contraption with a single, pulsing light. It pulsed with a sickening regularity, and with each pulse, the whisper intensified, growing from a sibilant rustle to a harsh, demanding hiss. I felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing me towards it, towards the source of the entity's voice. It wasn't merely a suggestion, it was a command, a deep-seated compulsion that threatened to override my own autonomy. Join us. The land demands. The words were not just an invitation, they were an insidious promise of belonging, of finally understanding the ancient secrets that had tormented me. But I knew, deep down, that belonging to it meant losing myself entirely. My determination, though fragile, ignited. I would not be another forgotten name in its long history of victims. A flash of crude drawings, ancient symbols scrawled on brittle parchment, alongside a fragment of a forgotten ritual. Not a map, but a countermap, a way to bind, to reseal. It spoke of a sacrifice, not of blood or life, but of self. A profound act of will, a severing of the tie that bound my blood to the land, to it. The land, the estate, the legacy, all of it had to be willingly, consciously, irrevocably renounced. It was the only way to sever the connection, to deny it the anchor it held in my very being. This was the ultimate betrayal of my ancestral calling, the dismantling of my life's work as a cartographer of history. It demanded not just my will, but my essence. The stakes became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just about my sanity, or even the fate of the crumbling estate. Its hunger was ancient, its reach insidious, and my lineage was merely the key, the weak point in the barrier. My actions here, in this sterile, horrifying hallway, would determine not only my fate but the fate of something far greater, something tied to the very earth beneath my feet. The pulsing light on the machine seemed to beckon, to promise oblivion. With a guttural cry, I forced my heavy limbs to move, pushing myself up from the cold floor, my gaze fixed on the endless hallway, on the path I now knew I had to take. The fight, I realized, had only just begun. The ancient promise, whispered through the dust and bone of generations, had festered within me, growing from a seed of curiosity into a malignant bloom. I had resisted, my mind a battleground, but the insidious truth of my inheritance, the understanding that I was the culmination, the final key, had solidified into a terrible resolve. There was no escape but through. No survival but surrender to the act. I would confront it, perform the grotesque ballet it demanded, and pray to whatever fractured gods remained that a sliver of myself might endure. My hands, trembling but steady, gathered the implements. Not tools for excavation, but for a darker purpose. A tarnished silver bowl, its surface scratched with forgotten symbols. A blade, its edge dulled by centuries of disuse, yet still holding the glint of ancient malevolence. It pointed, undeniably, to the deepest ventricle of the estate, a place I had only glimpsed in fevered dreams, a chamber far beneath the old crypt, older than the house itself. The descent began in the cellar, where the air hung thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten earth. My lantern cast a wavering circle of light, revealing shelves laden with cracked earthenware and cobwebbed bottles. I found the hidden passage behind a false wall, a trick of masonry I had discovered only after days of meticulous searching, guided by the map's final, cryptic markings. The entrance was a gaping maw of rough-hewn stone, smelling of wet earth and something else, something metallic and sweet, like old blood. I squeezed through, the rough rock scraping against my clothes, and stepped onto a narrow, uneven stairwell carved directly into the bedrock. The air here was dead, heavy, pressing down on me with an almost physical weight. Each breath felt like drawing in dust and decay. The entity's resistance began subtly. Come, Reid. Embrace what you are. I pushed past them, clinging to the cold stone of the wall, my knuckles white. Then came the visions. My stomach lurched. Was this what my mind was becoming? I closed my eyes, squeezed them shut until spots danced, and when I opened them again, the rough rock was back, blessedly, terrifyingly real. The stairs grew steeper, more perilous. Loose stones shifted beneath my boots, threatening to send me tumbling into the inky blackness below. The lantern flickered, its light suddenly weak, struggling against the encroaching gloom. I imagined unseen hands plucking at the wick, drawing the flame into the depths. I saw my ancestors, their faces gaunt and accusing, their mouths silently screaming my name. You are next. You are the last. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from above, dislodging a cascade of pebbles that rattled down the stairwell, bouncing off my shoulders. I flinched, pressing myself against the wall, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, a rhythm of pure, unadulterated fear. The entity wasn't just in my mind now, it was in the very stones, in the trembling air. The path itself was a trap. The air grew thick, humid, then suddenly bone-dry. My throat felt raw, parched. A phantom taste, like copper and ash, coated my tongue. The descent seemed endless, a spiraling plunge into the earth's deepest, most forgotten secrets. Beyond the arch, the passage widened into a vast, cavernous chamber. The air here hummed with a palpable, malevolent energy that prickled my skin and made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The lantern, though still flickering, seemed to gain a strange, sickly green hue. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, revealing not a natural cave, but a place clearly shaped by hands, though not human ones. The walls were not smooth, but rippled with strange, organic contours, like the inside of a massive, petrified throat. In the center, bathed in the sickly green glow of my lantern, stood an altar, a rough-hewn block of obsidian, slick and glistening as if perpetually wet. On its surface, an indentation, perfectly sized for the silver bowl. This was it. The place of the ritual. I had arrived. My breath hitched, a ragged gasp caught in the sudden, disorienting shift. The transition was less a journey and more a severing, a brutal tear in the fabric of what I understood as reality. My fingers, still clenched, found no rough-hewn rock, but the smooth, cool surface of a painted wall. This was not the estate yet, it was. I stumbled forward, my gaze sweeping the desolate expanse. Fluorescent lights, half-dead, cast sickly pools of yellow-green on linoleum floors, revealing scuff marks and faint, forgotten stains. Doorways lined the hallway, identical and menacing, each a potential maw. The machines, squat and pale, with their blinking lights and snaking tubes, stood like silent sentinels, their purpose unknown, their soft, mechanical sighs the only cadence in this purgatorial space. No staff. Only the hum, the dimness, and the suffocating weight of an ancient, malevolent will. Panic threatened to splinter my resolve, but then, a flicker. A pattern. My cartographer's eye, trained to seek order in chaos, began to trace the lines. The seams of the floor tiles, the stark angles where wall met ceiling, the equidistant placement of the doorways, they began to arrange themselves into a distorted grid. Not a hospital schematic, but a grotesque, living map. The estate. Its hidden passages, its buried chambers, its forbidden heart. All superimposed, warped, onto this sterile, alien stage. The entity desired not just my fear, but my surrender. But the map, my map, still lived in my mind. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the shard of obsidian I had carried from the estate, a remnant of the boundary stones. This wasn't merely a hallway, it was the final, distilled manifestation of the entity's domain. And here, I would draw the final line. With a surge of defiant clarity, I pressed the obsidian shard against the wall. The entity recoiled, a sudden, sharp intake of the air, a momentary cessation of the machine's breathing. It was a faint tremor, but I felt it, a flicker of anger, of surprise. My cartographic knowledge was not just about drawing lines, it was about defining space, about imposing order, about creating boundaries where chaos sought to reign. I began to move, my steps deliberate, my focus absolute. I dragged the obsidian along the wall, carving a shallow, unwavering line, a symbolic barrier. This was the first segment of the ritual, the delineation of the sacred from the profane, the known from the unknowable. The machine's breathing grew erratic, gasping, wheezing, mimicking a dying man's struggle. My breath came in ragged bursts, my arm aching, but I pushed on. I connected the lines, following the mental blueprint of the map, the geometry of containment. Each scratch was a ward, each corner a seal. It wanted me to falter, to doubt the efficacy of my strange, anachronistic ritual. But I held fast. The map was my lineage, my inheritance, and now, my shield. I saw the patterns, the ley lines of power, the points of vulnerability. The entity, ancient and vast, was bound by certain principles, by the very geography it sought to corrupt. My lines were not just scratches, they were channels, conduits, designed to draw its dispersed essence, to funnel it, to bind it to a single, contained point. This was the heart of its manifestation, the point where the map converged. With trembling hands, I knelt, the obsidian now dull from my relentless work. I began to draw a complex sigil on the floor, a symbol of binding and banishment, derived from the obscure annotations on the ancestral map. I could feel its tendrils probing my mind, seeking to break my will, to make me abandon the final stroke. It was a battle of pure endurance, my intellect against its ancient, malevolent force. Sweat streamed down my face, stinging my eyes. I could barely see the floor, but my fingers, guided by instinct and generations of ancestral knowledge, completed the final curve, the last interlocking line. As the obsidian lifted from the floor, a profound silence fell. The machines went utterly still. Replaced by an emptiness so vast, so complete, it was almost as terrifying as the entity itself. I had succeeded. The entity was contained, banished, perhaps even shattered, its power diffused and bound by the ritual, but the cost? Nothing. Only the echo of my own desperate victory. My eyes, heavy with an unseen film, struggled to parse the muted world. The corridor stretched long and deserted, bathed in a pallid, artificial glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. A rhythmic hiss-sigh echoed from behind a closed door nearby, the sound of some unseen apparatus maintaining a fragile rhythm in the stillness. I was not standing, I realized, but lying. My body felt alien, weighted by an unfamiliar softness. A thin sheet, crisp and cool against my skin, covered me from the chest down. My limbs, when I tried to move them, responded with a sluggishness that was both frustrating and terrifying. Each muscle protested, a deep, weary complaint that spoke of exhaustion far beyond anything I had ever known. I lifted a hand, finding it slow and tremulous. My fingers, once precise instruments, now trembled slightly. They were scars, I understood, though I could not recall their origin. My gaze drifted lower, over the sheet, to where my chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths. Beneath the fabric, I could discern the faint, raised ridges of other marks, a testament to some brutal encounter. My skin felt tight, stretched over bone in places, as if something had been flayed away and then haphazardly mended. The memories flickered at the edges of my vision, shards of nightmare too sharp to grasp directly. The estate. The map. A scream tried to claw its way from my throat, but it dissolved into a dry, rasping cough. My gaze swept the small, stark room I occupied. White walls, a single window draped in blinds that let in only a sliver of muted daylight, a chair, an empty stand. No personal effects. No maps. Nothing to anchor me to the Reid I once was. The entity was gone. I knew this with an absolute certainty that transcended logic. But its absence was not a relief, not truly. What remained was the indelible imprint of its touch, a residue that clung to my thoughts like a shroud. I saw things now, in the periphery of my mind's eye, fleeting glimpses of patterns and connections in the world that felt both ancient and utterly new. A fragment, indeed. The world outside this sterile place remained blissfully ignorant. I imagined the estate, now a ruin, its ancient stones rent and scattered, the earth around it scarred, perhaps even quieted. The land had taken its toll, and I had paid my price. My life, meticulously ordered, mapped, and charted, was now a tattered, illegible scroll. The cartographer in me was dead, replaced by something other. A metallic click echoed from the hallway, followed by the soft squeak of rubber soles against linoleum. My breath hitched again, the sound of approaching life, yet I felt no comfort. What would they see when they looked at me? A man broken, a mind fractured? I closed my eyes, feigning sleep, wishing to remain adrift in the silent, humming limbo, for the waking world promised only a new, more profound kind of horror. The cost had been paid, but the ledger of my torment felt far from balanced. The air here was thin, scrubbed clean of the earth's ancient musk, yet carried a faint, metallic tang that prickled the back of my throat. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent drumbeat behind my temples. And then, now, this humming quiet. This antiseptic pallor. I moved, my steps tentative, the cheap rubber soles of my shoes squeaking faintly on the polished linoleum. Where was I? More importantly, when was I? There were no windows, no clocks, only the rhythmic sigh of unseen machines exhaling behind opaque doors. It was gone. All of it. The parchment, the charcoal dust, the scent of ancient earth. Days bled into a blur, a soft focus haze of quiet observation and hushed conversations with a kind-faced attendant who spoke of recovery and rest. I offered no resistance, no questions, for the words themselves felt like foreign objects in my mouth. My mind, a fractured landscape, refused to coalesce. The attendant, a woman with weary eyes, brought me pale food and cool water, speaking in a voice that sought to soothe, yet held a subtle, pitying edge. She never mentioned the estate, never the map. It was as if that chapter of my life had been cleanly excised, a malignant growth removed. The world felt muted, a landscape drained of its vibrant hues. The sun, once a source of warmth and clarity, now seemed merely a pale, indifferent disk in the sky. My hands, once so steady and precise with a quill, trembled sometimes, a ghost of the frantic energy that had driven me. I attempted to return to my cartography, to the meticulous lines and historical research that had once been the bedrock of my existence. I purchased new parchment, sharpened new pencils, even bought a fresh bottle of India ink. My eyes, once so keen for detail, now saw patterns in the cross-hatching of a leaf that weren't there, saw the faint, shifting contours of something beneath the surface of every map. The estate, that sprawling, decaying monument to my lineage, remained untouched. I received periodic letters from a solicitor, discussing its upkeep, the possibility of sale. Each envelope, crisp and white, felt like a venomous insect, its contents a reminder of the price I had paid. I could not bring myself to sell it. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. My nights were the worst. sleep offered no true escape, only a different kind of imprisonment. I walked the hidden passages of the estate in my dreams, felt the damp stone beneath my fingers, heard the low, resonant hum of the earth. Sometimes, a name would form on the edge of my consciousness, a word not spoken but felt, a name that was also a command. The compulsion was subtle, a whisper at first, then a persistent current beneath the surface of my thoughts. I found myself drawn to maps of ancient burial sites, to geological surveys that charted the hidden veins of the land. I was no longer merely mapping the surface, I was mapping the unseen star. Sometimes, late at night, when the town was quiet and the stars were sharp pinpricks in the black velvet sky, I would take out my old, incomplete map of the estate. The edges were worn, the folds soft. My finger would hover over the spot where the entity lay entombed, and I would feel it, a faint, almost imperceptible thrumming beneath the paper, a vibration that resonated deep within my own bones. I hadn't escaped. I hadn't won. I had merely traded one cage for another. The entity was contained, yes, but it was not gone. It lived within me now, a silent, demanding passenger. I was its unwitting guardian, its solitary sentinel. The price I paid was not merely my peace of mind, but my very self. Reid, the meticulous cartographer, was gone. In his place was a man perpetually poised on the edge of a precipice, forever listening to the faint, ancient pulse of the earth, forever guarding a secret that had become entwined with the very fabric of his being. The horror was contained, but it lived on, a silent, insidious victory.